Good afternoon. For the past couple of months, we've been working on creating an intuitive dashboard to provide a greater understanding into how COVID-19 pandemic is unfolding across the nation's communities, especially on communities with large concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. As we've seen across studies and media, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted communities across the nation, especially in Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black communities. The overview for my presentation is as follows. I will do a quick overview of the dashboard's data, layout, and functions, followed by a quick demo analyzing local impacts of Puerto Rican communities in New York, and if we have enough time, for Massachusetts. I will then end it with a Q&A. Let's get started. As outlined in the figure below, our dashboard integrates various data sets. The list of variables and sources methodologies can be found in our website's toolbox or underneath the graphics within the dashboard. The variables are categorized in the following: social impact indices, which include severe housing, economic vulnerability, food insecurity, inadequate facilities, and digital divide index. Then we have the COVID Community Index, CCVI, which includes healthcare facilities, high-risk environment, and CDC Social Vulnerability Index. We then have the risk exposure, which we've broken down by different ethnic groups for non-Hispanic Blacks, whites, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Mexicans, and Cubans. Then we have the COVID-19 data, which is updated daily, and it includes COVID infections, COVID deaths, percent vaccinated adults, and ability to handle a COVID outbreak. Lastly, we have census data, which includes overall population, percent of the population that are 65 years and over, percent uninsured, percent below poverty, and lastly, population by race and ethnicity, and Hispanic and Latinos by subgroups. The general layout of the dashboard is as follows. So it's a lot of information, but I think it's important to sort of know the layout. On the left-hand side, we have indice sliders, which is connected, so which is this part. And in the dashboard, it looks like this. These sliders are connected to the interactive map and layers. I will discuss this a bit further during the demo. Above the map contains the general information related to the geography or the selected geography's total population and other characteristics. Population by race, ethnicity, and subpopulation Latino groups is located on the upper right side of the dashboard in the form of pie charts. So it's located here. The social impact indices, COVID impact community index, and risk exposure index is located on the lower left side of the dashboard in the form of bar charts. Lastly, a temporal line graph below the map contains the COVID cases and deaths for the last 14 days and 12 months, which is located here. Now let's look at a macro level analysis before we get into the local analysis. So here we have the dashboard. And we have the pre-selected layer that you see now is the COVID infections rate. And if you want to change that layer, so we have all the layers listed here. Okay. And let's deselect the COVID infections and select the risk exposure index for Puerto Ricans in the US. Okay. Now let's see what the breakdown is. So we see here risk exposure. So the darker the shade is, so red and orange signifies high, moderate to high risk exposure. So as we can see here, the northeast, parts of the south, and west coast counties with Puerto Rican's high risk exposures, we see a lot of those counties with high risk exposures. And you could play around with the sliders here on the left side. So if you want to look into specific counties with high COVID infection rates or with high COVID death rates, you're able to do that as well. So here we have, okay. Now let's look at counties with a moderate social vulnerability index. So we select that, or a very high social vulnerability index. So we have some of those, not only high Puerto Rican risk exposure index, but also high social vulnerability index. Okay. Now let's look into a in-depth look of Puerto Ricans in New York State. So just for context reasons, New York State had the second largest concentration of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. with an estimated population of 1 million, with the majority of Puerto Ricans residing in Bronx County. Puerto Ricans account for about 6% of the state's overall population. There was a slight increase between 2018 and 2019. Okay. Now let's navigate this by selecting New York State. Let's click on Puerto Rican concentrated states. You will see the 13 states there, but we only want to look into New York State. So now let's filter this out from New York. And again, the pre-selected layer here is the COVID infections. But we want to look into the Puerto Rican risk exposure. So again, the bar charts and the general information above changes according to the selected geography. Now let's change this. Oh, here you have your layers. Let's deselect the COVID infection layer and select the risk exposure. As we can see here, and we have the legend right there. We see the high risk exposure amongst the Puerto Ricans in the New York State region, New York City region, Long Island, downstate, and parts of upstate New York. And as you can see here, we have the information that changes. Now let's look at areas or counties with a very high social vulnerability index and a high Puerto Rican risk exposure. Okay, so we see parts of downstate. Here we have Monroe County and parts of New York City region counties that it picks up. Let's reset this. Let's look at housing cost burden index. So it will select the counties with a very high cost burden index. So again, we see parts of New York City region, upstate New York. But let's take a closer look at Bronx County. So we'll zoom into Bronx County. Here's some data, COVID data related to Bronx County. We have the breakdown of the Hispanic subpopulation group and population by ethnicity. Now let's look into the indices. Okay. Let's open this up. We also have the COVID deaths, cases for the last 14 days and 12 months. Okay. Now let's look at Monroe County. That was the other county with a very high social vulnerability index and high housing cost burden. So again, we have the information here that relates to the general population in terms of COVID cases and deaths, social impact indices. So you can see here, right? I know I'm going a little fast, but I think I'm running out of time. But again, all of this is available to you. We see that Puerto Ricans and Dominicans have a very high risk exposure. I think that's about it. I'm pretty sure we're going to have a much longer demo, but for the sake of time, we're going to have to cut it a bit short. And here is my information. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.